What are luxury beliefs?
Well, luxury beliefs, this is a framework I've been developing for a few years now. I define luxury beliefs as ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the less fortunate members of society. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And there are different kinds of moving parts and ideas that are involved in this framework, and we can get into specific examples. But for me, this luxury beliefs idea, it's rooted in some of my personal experiences, sort of traveling along the class ladder in the U.S. I was born in foster homes, and had a series of kind of chaotic and stressful experiences as a kid. So I fled as soon as I could when I was 17 and joined the military, and then went off to Yale on the GI Bill, and then off to the University of Cambridge on a scholarship to get a PhD. So I've had kind of varied life experiences, but during those, during that journey, I was also reading a lot about social class. So the luxury beliefs idea, you could trace it back to Thorstein Veblen, who wrote a book in 1899 called The Theory of the Leisure Class. And it's kind of a dense book written in kind of turn of the 20th century language. But the key idea in that book is that because we can't be certain about the financial status of other people, a good way to size up their means is to see whether they could afford luxury goods, expensive material possessions, top hats and pocket watches and evening gowns, and the kinds of clothes that people would exhibit back in 1899. If you fast forward to the mid 20th century, different sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu and others wrote about this idea called cultural capital, about how elites will convert their economic wealth into kind of cultural status symbols. And at that point, these were things like intricate and arcane knowledge about wine and art and exotic locations. And when you express that kind of knowledge, you're sub-communicating that you went to an expensive school, you have access to exclusive social circles, you come from an affluent family. And my claim is that luxury beliefs are the kind of latest manifestation of that cultural capital, whereby people who express luxury beliefs tend to come from well-off backgrounds. And in my book and in Substack essays and various places where I've written about luxury beliefs, I cite statistics indicating that, the various examples of luxury beliefs, consistently you'll see that the higher up you go in socioeconomic status and education, the more likely you are to hear these kinds of opinions that, that make you sound interesting and sophisticated and compassionate, and sub-communicate your level of education and the type of job you have and the social circles you have access to. But when those ideas are implemented into policy or spread throughout the culture, you often see that they have harmful effects for people who have less education and less access to wealth and resources and aren't in as fortunate a position.
Yeah, and just to give people some visual illustrations of that, like what are some modern examples of these luxury beliefs that are panning around so people get an idea?
Yeah, well, I can give two. So one example that's had a lot of relevance over the last couple of years, that's now it's on the decline, is the defund the police movement that captured a lot of attention in 2020. So when I was at Yale in 2015, I was what they called like a mature student. I spent 8 years in the military and then started my freshman year. I was 25 years old, my first year on campus. And I kind of saw during that time, like the defund the police movement in its embryonic stage, where people would talk a lot about decarceration, of opening the prisons and reforming the justice system in a more lenient way. And then by 2020, it had evolved and spread into defund the police, of just eliminating law enforcement altogether. And I during that time I was in grad school and I was very interested in surveys and statistics and data. And I thought, okay, well, this is very popular. You're seeing headlines that say, yes, we literally mean abolish the police in very prominent media outlets. So I looked at the data, and if you looked at representative samples of Americans, consistently these surveys showed that the highest income Americans were the most in support of defunding the police, and the least the lowest earning Americans were the least in support of it. And even if you parse the data by political orientation, white Democrats were always by far the most in favor of defunding the police, and Black and Hispanic Democrats were the least in favor of it. But the impression you got from a lot of cultural elites and prominent media outlets was that this was a movement with a lot of force, and there were metropolitan areas in the US that did reduce spending for law enforcement. And then as a consequence, from about 2020 to 2022, you saw violent crime rates skyrocketed. They've kind of leveled out. They're on the decline. They're kind of plateauing now. But for a 2-3 year period, there was a spike in homicides, violent crimes, and so on. And when you look at who are the primary targets of violent crime, who's the most likely to suffer from assault, burglary, theft, rape, murder, and so on, these are poor people. The data shows that if you compare relative to the median income earning American, the poorest Americans are 7 times more likely to be victims of violent assault and robbery, and 20 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault. And because there are relatively few perpetrators of crime compared with the number of victims, if you don't penalize crimes, you're actually indirectly victimizing poor people. And there are other data on this. I mean, I was a bit irritated when I would see like late 2022. You would open the pages of the newspaper or the website, whatever you read, and you can see, like year over year crime has increased X amount since 2019. But then when you looked at the data, there would be these popular news stories of, there was a tech executive in San Francisco who was stabbed. There were a couple of high profile cases of journalists who were murdered, and these individuals got like entire articles written about them. And I just found it, there was this kind of double standard here, where if you are a member of a poor, marginalized group, you just get folded into these statistics. But if you are a member of the modern aristocracy, then you get an entire article written about you, and then people start to wake up and start to reform and reconsider the policies they'd been approaching. So that's one example, the defund the police movement. Another would be, and I write about this in my book too, about this wild proliferation of technology and screens. People who develop these technologies often profit from them, but in their private lives, they exert a great deal of control and sort of monitoring carefully their usage of these devices. And so, famously, for example, Steve Jobs wouldn't let his children use iPads. There are stories out of Silicon Valley where tech executives hire personal nannies to watch their kids to make sure they don't use phones, and send their kids to these schools that are screen-free. But then publicly, often what you hear is that these devices are going to revolutionize education and level the playing field and so on, and make everyone smarter and increase access for poor kids. But those very same people are often, they don't allow their own kids to use these things. So there are kind of different ways you can think about the luxury beliefs idea. Those are two examples. It's increasing your own standing, your own profit, your own reputation. But then the concrete consequences often result in, people being harmed in some way, whether poor children in the case of devices, or poor people in the case of defunding the police.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, because you mentioned that these luxury beliefs are the new luxury goods, and it's ultimately just status signaling phenomenon. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on how this has changed throughout the history of humanity. Let's say if you look at, the Roman empires or the conquerors that decided to go, and some certain people just didn't know when to stop, right? Didn't necessarily benefit any of the people. Maybe it actually put them more in danger, because if the battles were lost, then it could actually bite them in the ass, right? But for them, this idea of being able to conquer more land was a status signaling thing, that they're more powerful and that they're, that they have the skills to be able to do that. Didn't necessarily benefit a lot of the people. It may actually have hurt them. So if you look at current luxury beliefs being this modern thing, how do you think that's changed from the modern times to history? Because I think powerful people have always signaled this idea of luxury beliefs in some way.
Yeah. So the phrase, I came up with that luxury beliefs phrase, but yeah, the idea predates the phrase. Sometimes an idea has been sort of out there in the ether for a while before someone kind of labels it and identifies it and tries to formalize it. But yeah, there's different examples of this. I remember when I first started writing about this, one of my readers sent me this excerpt from this novel written in 1881 called Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. And it's a fictional novel where these characters are discussing the habits of the upper class at that time. And one of the characters says, well, you look at the radicals of the upper class and their beliefs are their biggest luxury. These beliefs make them look good, but often there's no sincerity behind them, and they don't actually believe that these beliefs will help anyone. So they didn't quite say luxury beliefs, but they came close. But the drive, what you're describing, like the drive for status, that's been with humanity for eons, from the very beginning. There's a nice book called The Status Game by Will Storr, and he describes kind of three status games. So one, the oldest status game would be dominance games. And this is kind of what you're describing about conquering land and territory and seizing resources and seizing wealth from others. And the dominance games, you can see this even in non-human animals and chimpanzee troops and gorilla harems and among other animals that success and status kind of depends on your ability to intimidate and to use force. And you see this with humans too, to a lesser extent. I think, fortunately, society, we've reached a point where at least overt dominance games are frowned upon, except for kind of niche areas like maybe prisons or street gangs or something like that. But generally, we don't look kindly on people who take status by force. And then, there's another kind of status game, what Will Storr calls virtue games. And these are games in which people compete based on how moral or compassionate, how ethical you are, how shiny your reputation is. And I think this is kind of related to the luxury beliefs idea. There is an element of the desire for moral character. Not all luxury beliefs, like the aforementioned, selling, like profiting from devices while privately not using them. Like that's not exactly. There's not a moral element to that. But the other luxury beliefs, like the defund the police idea about looking compassionate, that kind of thing. And that can spiral out of control too, because often you'll find like people will pile on. They'll find someone who's committed a transgression. And, if I do something bad, one way for other people to look good is to condemn me for it and to talk about how bad I am, with the subtext being they would never do something like that. So it gives them a way to express hostility toward others while often sort of indirectly communicating how good they are. And then there's competence games or success games. And this is basically like doing things that are important for other people, helping other people, building things. And this is kind of more modern expression of the desire for status, of doing something that matters to other people and that helps other people. So competence games. But generally, like, if you look at the kind of evolutionary psychology of status, psychologists will often break down status into two kinds of categories, where status isn't just one thing. So I'd mentioned dominance before in human communities, where this is done through intimidation, force, reputational destruction. So someone like Joseph Stalin acquired status through dominance. And often people who are very cynical think like all of status is about dominance. It's all about power and exerting force. But the other way that status is attained is through prestige. And prestige is basically doing impressive things that make people want to be associated with you. So dominance is, we confer status to people who are dominant because of what they can do to us, humiliate us, injure us, disfigure us, destroy our reputations. And we confer status to prestigious individuals because of what they can do for us. If they invent things or help to acquire new knowledge, or pioneers in different fields. And Often if you are affiliated with a prestigious person, you get a little bit of their status that rubs off on you. And so, this is why people like taking selfies with celebrities. And so someone like Stephen Hawking would be an example, the late physicist. He would be an example of someone who acquired status through prestige. He very obviously didn't acquire it through dominance, but people had a great deal of respect for him and would freely confer admiration and esteem to him because of what an impressive person he was. And so I think, today we still see versions of these different games and these different manifestations of status. But I think, the luxury beliefs idea, I should clarify here. I'm not saying that every belief held by, a high status, affluent person is necessarily a luxury belief. But luxury beliefs are the ones that make you look good to your peers, but are often harmful for people outside of your group. So that doesn't mean like, oh, I have this belief and I'm rich. Does that mean that I have a luxury belief? That's not necessarily the case.
Right. And where do you think that falls into? Because you mentioned the dominance, you mentioned the competency, which is the third one, and then would that fall in more into the second one, you think?
Which one? Sorry. So there's virtue, dominance, and competence. It's three kind of
So
frameworks
virtue.
there.
Would a lot of modern luxury beliefs be around virtue signaling?
Among those three, I mean, it is odd because even though the way that sort of sociological frameworks and social theories work, they're never sort of completely separable from one another. They often bleed into one another. So for luxury beliefs, I would say generally they fall under the virtue category, but they can sort of spiral out into the dominance realm as well, where if you don't support this specific luxury belief, then I'm going to destroy your reputation and I'm going to be very hostile to you and find ways to ostracize you or exile you from this group. And so there can be an element of dominance there as well. But generally, I think the virtue category is what they would generally fall into.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about this as like, I'm sure you're familiar with Skin in the Game by Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Oh, yeah.
And I think about the difference between the people that we talked about, like the conquerors or the emperors that had skin in the game, to be able to get the statuses that they're looking for, they had to fight. They had to be in the front lines and potentially risk their lives. And then you look at more of the modern virtue signaling where with the push of a button, they can signal virtue just by reposting something that someone else said just to support something, something like defund the police or talking about polygamy, just based on that without really much of a downside. That you haven't really earned anything. You haven't really put yourself in the game. You're just kind of virtue signaling. And I wonder if because of that, it's kind of changed the game of like how easy it is to be able to do that, especially with the spread of information like social media.
Yeah, that seems right. That there's there's potential upside to acquiring reputation by supporting these beliefs, but then there's no cost if they go catastrophically wrong. So no one is ever going to be held accountable for the crime rise as a result of the defund the police movement. So a lot of people got to look interesting and sophisticated and compassionate by championing this supposed sympathetic cause. But as a result of that movement, there were people who suffered and people who were harmed, and no one's going to be held accountable for that. So that is a nice kind of way to integrate those ideas.
What's the consequence when we're prioritizing status signaling over the pursuit of truth?
Yeah. So we have these competing motives about pursuit of truth. We want to know what's true about the world, but we also have this other motive, which is often even stronger. We want to be well liked. We want to be accepted by our peer group, and often when we are considering potential facts about the world or ideas that reflect reality, we filter it through this mechanism of how much will this affect my reputation if I were to believe this and incorporate this into my worldview? What will my friends and family think? What will my coworkers think? And people whose opinions are relevant to me. And so we have this, conflicting internal tension. So and yeah, I wonder with social media if this is, the tensions are even more amplified, because people now it's not just your friends and your family and your peers, but it's, potentially, the entire user base of that particular platform. Everyone might find out about it, and so people can be more cautious. And there's what Timur Kuran calls preference falsification, of people who maybe internally believe one thing or having some doubts, but will publicly support a set of values or ideas, um, simply because it's expedient and socially convenient to do so. And what's interesting is, like, people are pretty good at convincing themselves of things that they need to believe. Just because something happens to align with your reputational interests and then you express it doesn't necessarily make it duplicitous. And in fact, you often become even more sincere as a result. If I believe in a certain opinion, or rather, if a certain opinion will increase my reputation, and then I say that opinion, it's not necessarily because I'm being duplicitous. Often people will convince themselves of, oh, like, if this is the thing I need to say, then I'll find a way to believe it. I'll do the mental gymnastics necessary, to incorporate this into my worldview. And it's funny because you will see, kind of months later, sometimes years later, people will change their opinion, and because that's the opinion at that point that they need to believe in order to enhance their reputation and their social image in the eyes of others. So yeah, it's a good question. And I think there are, a handful, I don't know what percentage of people who value and prioritize truth more than reputation, but those are, kind of rare types of people. And in an ideal world, this is why, like in academic science, we have things like peer review, and we have, scientific conferences and communities where ideally people will check each other and find way where you sort of bolster your reputation by being open to the truth, by being open to new ideas, regardless of where they may lead. But even in those communities, you often see those other, very human, reputational concerns take precedence.
Yeah, and I feel like, back in 2021, I think 2021, 22, kind of at the peak of cancel culture, I really saw this come to light, like in a crazy sense, where it's almost like often framed as justice without the forgiveness for just being able to express your own opinion. And I wonder if like this fear of being potentially canceled is preventing people um from diminishing these luxury beliefs, because there are consequences to these days, whether it's political or whether it's certain values, not agreeing with what's within the trend of this year or the next year.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's sort of how these ideas are enforced in the first place. But there is this kind of interesting paradox where, if something is obviously true, you wouldn't need to punish people for not saying it, right? Like, we would all just agree the sky is blue, there it is. But if there's a possibility that an idea is not true, then I need to punish you for not believing in it, because we all need to come to a consensus on what's true and what's not true. And if you say something, then that might give other people ideas, and so we need to make an example of someone who challenges this belief. Because often, those sort of third-party punishment scenarios where someone says something that goes against the luxury belief, the fashionable belief of the day, it's not necessarily so much about punishing that individual person who dissents, but it's also about sending a message to onlookers, that this will be your fate if you also call into question this belief that we've all agreed upon. So yeah, it's the luxury beliefs idea. There's sort of layers to that, but definitely tied up in status and reputation and social image concerns.
Yeah, and how much of this do you think is correlated with the decline of traditional religion, where people had this identity wrapped up in a community that they could rely on, but the way you got rewarded in religion was quite different. You had devotion and charity and faith. That was kind of the way you were rewarded, versus when people lost this identity and purpose of God or whatever they that used to believe in, they have to now hold on to something else that gives them some sort of an identity and purpose. And a lot of that comes from your political beliefs or climate change, whatever it might be. And the difference of that, as you mentioned, is that in this case, the way to signal that and to signal that you have this identity might benefit you or may not harm you, but it may harm people that are in the lower class and other parts of society. So I'm curious to like get your thoughts on if there's been this correlation between the decline of traditional religion to a rise of luxury beliefs.
Yeah, there's been some interesting work on this about who are the strongest and most vocal champions of very fashionable, often progressive causes, and these are generally affluent white liberals. And this is also the group that is the least likely to um, express any religious belief. They're the most likely to check, that they're an atheist or agnostic or non-religious, that they don't attend religious services. So there is a kind of correlation there between absence of religiosity and then that void being filled with, political causes and political commitments. And there does seem to be this longing for some kind of higher order or metaphysical, something that will legitimize your moral views. And for a lot of people, that can be religion. But if you don't have religion, you need to find other ways to come across as a good person. And one way to do that would be to take up these seemingly compassionate political causes and to be very vocal about your belief in them and how this is going to help people and that kind of thing. But I don't. It doesn't seem to be working. If you look at kind of the research on happiness, there's a political divide whereby conservatives report higher levels of well-being and life satisfaction and happiness, and there seem to be a bunch of different reasons for that. One is marriage. Married people tend to be happier on average than unmarried people. People who attend religious services tend to be happier than non-religious people. There was at least one study that found that going to a religious service at least once a week, in terms of its effect on happiness, it would be like going from the bottom income quartile to the top income quartile.
Wow.
Um, and and so liberals on average report less happiness than conservatives, and this could be in part because they're less likely to be married, less likely to be religious, and sort of have fewer sources of meaning in their lives, and they may be flailing for some source of meaning, and maybe that's perhaps filled by these political beliefs. I think there's an element of this on the kind of young, what they call them, the new right, the dissident right. A lot of them are not religious either, and they are seeking some kind of fulfillment in politics as well, whether through this deification of Trump or Musk or something, or through these kind of political skirmishes with sort of left wing factions that are also tied up in politics. So I think like the patterns underlying it, it's not necessarily entirely confined to one side or the other.
Why do you think it is that people that are trying to find that meaning and identity run towards politics? Or is it a bias? Are we just seeing more of those opinions because they're the people that are speaking out and they're the people that are creating content? I don't know, but I found that interesting.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, if you because what is politics? Politics is one way to think about it is sort of how do we allocate limited resources to our favorite groups, and if you believe that sort of material resources and worldly goods, like that's all that matters, then, and there is no higher value, no metaphysical value, no afterlife, no spirituality, in the absence of religion, people are much more focused on the here and now. On politics takes up a lot of our lives. It's in mass media, it's in social media, and yeah, it seems to be it fills that void, and it's it seems to have kind of direct relevance to people's lives, people who are power hungry, people who are interested in vanquishing rivals and increasing the esteem of their own group. So it can be very intoxicating. There are sort of deep, I think it speaks to something in human nature too, the way that religion does, but because religion has been sort of denigrated and pathologized and dismissed, the next obvious thing seems to be politics. Maybe for some people it can be sports, it can be other things, but just something people are very quick to group themselves into coalitions and want to engage in kind of online warfare because it's exciting for them.
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, you kind of select your tribe, where you feel like you belong, and you end up in this endless discourse that never really gets anywhere, and you can't really. Yeah, it makes sense. Um, have you studied how people around different cultures signal status and how that's different from Western or lower income countries to high income countries, and how that's kind of changed?
Yeah, there's some interesting work on, like so there's this idea in social psychology called the better than average effect. And this is this belief that most people believe that they are better than the average person. If you ask them, who's smarter, you or the average person, most people will say, well, I'm smarter than the average person. Or what about driving? In terms of your driving skills, most people say they're better driver than average. The big one is in terms of ethics and moral character. Almost everyone says that they are better than average in terms of their moral character. The one exception to this, studies find prison inmates. Prison inmates report that they are average in moral character. So despite being in prison for breaking the law, they consider themselves about average. But there's one exception overall to the better than average effect, which is about our social lives. We can get into that later. But when you ask people about the qualities that are valued in your particular culture, so in Western, or what sometimes psychologists will call like weird societies, people in Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, things like assertiveness and leadership qualities are highly valued. And so when you ask people in these weird societies, places like the U.S. and Europe and the Anglosphere, like about their leadership skills, people will generally say like, "Oh, I have good leadership skills." They'll overrate themselves or overvalue themselves on these qualities that are valued in that society. In other cultures, where like being a good listener is valued, or promoting the harmony and cooperation of the group in more interdependent cultures, in non-weird societies, people will say that they're better. They'll overvalue their own skills in those domains. And then when you look at like hunter-gatherer societies, pre-industrialized societies, the way that status is acquired, it's who can grow the largest fruits, or who can kill the largest number of animals, or who's the best at medicine making or basket weaving or navigation, those kinds of things. So the underlying motivation of sort of impressing other people and wanting other people to value you and confer esteem to you, that's universal. But yeah, there are kind of specific manifestations of it depending on the culture, and sometimes it can be productive, and sometimes it can be more sort of pathological and harmful.
Yeah, I think something around like 70 to 75% of men think they can win in a street fight.
Yeah. There are those
Talk
funny
about
polls,
pathological.
right? Yeah, there was some funny like YouGov survey about like the question was like, could you defeat a gorilla in a fist fight? And it's like 12% of American men said they could, and it was
Yeah,
like, who are
yeah. I
these
saw that.
12% of men who could take out a gorilla? Yeah, those are hilarious.
So funny. I mean, that's a prime example, dangerous example actually for people that actually believe that. But yeah, I found it interesting just because I was born in Korea, moved to Canada, more of a Western place, and then as we said off podcast, spending a lot of my time here in South America, and I saw the contrast of these kind of like the way my parents believed what status was, or my grandparents, which is like you can't be too skinny growing up in Korea, so they would always feed me because they didn't want me to look too skinny. If you look at like the extreme end of that, you look at Kim Jong Un, who is probably like quite chubby, chubbiest amongst all of the society that lives in North Korea, because that to them signals he can eat, he can feed himself, he's eating great. And I found the other contrast to be really interesting when I moved to South America, and I was speaking with a girl, and she told me she had braces for 4 years. I was like, why aren't you in a rush to take it off? And she was just, for her in South America, having braces is signaling status that you have money.
Oh, right. Interesting.
It's
Okay.
like the equivalent of like grills. You know how a lot of the Americans wear grills
Yeah.
and it's like made out of gold? Like that's kind of
Huh.
what braces are to
That's
a lot of
interesting.
people in, in South America, obviously amongst average income holders. And yeah, it's so
Yeah.
different across different cultures.
I'm thinking about like skin tone too, where, historically, a lot of societies, having lighter skin was high status because it meant you weren't working outside, and darker skin was lower status because it meant you were working outside. You're working manual labor jobs. But now, at least in a lot of Western countries, this seems to have flipped, where being tan is like a signal of, oh, you can afford to go on vacation in tropical areas and you don't have a day job and you look like you're relaxed and have a lot of leisure time to travel. Although even then it can be tricky, even within the same culture, right? Like a friend of mine who works in finance here in New York, he said that you can't. It's considered what it like you're not treated as a serious person if you're tanned. Like even if you get back from vacation and you're very tan, your colleagues won't respect you because they even when you're on vacation, you're expected to be working. And so if you come back from work and you show up in your suit and tie and you're very tan, it's like, oh, like you've just been laying around, not working, just enjoying the sun. So even here, there are like different cultures that there are some nuances, some complexities.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I want to shift the conversation to, I guess, modern men and kind of the crisis that they're having. Um, I guess a lot of a lot of people are confused. A lot of young people in general are pretty confused about where they fit into this elite ideology. What advice would you give to young people who feel this pressure to conform to these ideologies just to survive professionally, within society, within their friends?
Yeah. I mean, there are so many things that could be said, but young men, we live in a weird time now where, you know, often gender relations, it's like viewed as this zero sum game where, for decades, progressive causes, feminist movements, they've sought to sort of redress and create some balance and achieve equality. But now you look at a lot of statistics and studies, and at least among young people. So because like boomers and Gen X, like some of the older people, you still see like more men, earning more money and are in more positions of power. But that's because they, when they were coming up, they were in a different era. And now when you look at people under 30, for example, women are, far outpacing men in terms of educational attainment. In many cities, women are rivaling or exceeding men's earnings. And yeah, more likely to go on to graduate school and find employment, more likely to find romantic partners. There are a lot more young men who are single than young women. And more young men who are dropping out of the workforce, not even seeking work. So yeah, and it's there's not a lot of scaffolding in place to help men find their footing. No positive role models, or few positive role models anyway. So yeah, I think the advice would be try to find someone. I mean, ideally in your real life, but if you don't have anyone in your real life, then someone online, someone who you would like to emulate and aspire to be, and who, that you find respectable, and kind of use them as a template or a role model. And I think that is one of the benefits of increased access to information and the internet and social media is I know a lot of young guys who tell me that they whatever, like they'll listen to like David Goggins or something, and that'll give them some motivation to, instead of smoking more weed and playing more video games, they get up and hit the gym and apply to some jobs and try to get their life together. And so there are these kind of distant parasocial role models out there that you could find too, but there are guys out there who are attempting to give good advice to young men. So just seek those people out and try to find a community of other like-minded men around you, even if it's just one person, a friend, someone who can help keep you accountable and that you can share tips and advice and cheer each other on as you attempt to improve yourselves. I talked to this guy recently who, he's like a self-identified reformed incel, and he's engaged now, and he's a really smart guy. He's got a good job. And he said when he was in his teen, so he's I think 25 now, but he said when he was a teenager, he said he was overweight. All he did was play video games, and something clicked for him one day, and he was like, "Why am I playing video games when I could just be like living my life in the real world? And instead of leveling up in the game, I can level up in the gym and in my job and in my career." And it took him a couple of years to lose the weight and find the mindset that worked for him and sources of motivation. But yeah, he it took him, I don't know, eight years, something like that, before he finally got to the position he's in now. And he's 25. And so from the outside world, he's a 25-year-old guy who's got his life together, but they don't know that, when he was 16, 17 years old, all he did was, play games and watch porn and, smoke weed and feel miserable. So you can find ways to turn things around.
Yeah, because that's a tough place to be. Like I remember that age range between 18 to 22, particularly right when you finish college and you're going into the real world. You're an adult. You're not treated as a student. You're not treated as a kid. And you don't have enough experience yet to be valuable to society. You're not making money to attract the partners that you're looking to attract. You don't have the experience, but yet you're still not treated as a student. You're like a proper adult at this point. And like you mentioned, women are now being more enrolled into college, which generally correlates to more income. And because of the hypergamous nature of women, for a lot of them, a lot of the men in their early 20s, how do they attract women that are, around their age range? It's a tricky and tough place to be in. And I can certainly resonate with that because I've been there myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I sympathize, but I went through it myself. I mean, if we're talking about guys in college, then there's no excuse because you're outnumbered. You are the scarce commodity, right? Like on college campuses, it's something like 60% women on average. And so, there's some interesting theorizing here about like what gave rise to hookup culture. And one contributing factor may have been the fact that there are so few men on campus that whichever sex is more scarce in an environment, then that scarce sex gets to enact their preferences. And so you see, like in places where there are relatively few men and lots of women, that often casual sex is more likely to take place because women are more willing to have short-term casual encounters in order to try to win over these men. But then in environments, and even in college campuses, there are some studies, like in places like Caltech, there are a handful of colleges where there are more men than women. And in places where the ratio is lopsided, such that there are more men than there are women on campus, people are more likely to form long-term relationships because then men adjust their behavior in ways that women prefer, which is usually, emotional commitment and relationships and forming those attachments. But for guys who aren't in college, I was one of those guys. I enlisted in the military when I was 17. And I think I went, probably 4 years without a girlfriend, or without, like 17 to 21, because you're just in training, you're living on base, you're like around a bunch of other guys. There's like not really, and you can't go to bars or anything until you're 21. So it's just a pretty miserable existence.
So you have no sympathy for these young men. You're like,
yeah, I sympathize in the sense, like, I understand what they're feeling. I feel their pain. I went through it. But on the other hand, partially as a result of, I was in this environment, but during those 4 years, I was, working out, and, I had a job, and I was saving money, and I was attempting to improve myself, in my own imperfect way, so that by the time I was in my 20s, I was in a better position to, if I did meet someone that I liked, like, my chances were better than they would have been if I was just, 17, living at home or whatever. So, there are ways. So even if, like, it is the case, like, during those years, they're just going to be miserable, especially if you're not in college, and you might as well just accept that up front. But during those years, in the meantime, you can use those to, put yourself in a position that you can have a good career, get a job, make some money, get a car, sort of get yourself together, work out, find style of clothes that work for you and your body, your physique, your haircut. Like, there are all kinds of things. And then just, have interesting experiences and develop a perspective and a worldview, and try to learn from people smarter than you, so that, once you enter your early and mid 20s, you're a more interesting person. And then, yeah, girls that age that overlooked you, when you were 19 or 20, they will be willing to talk to you when you're 24 or whatever, and have a bit more life experience.
Yeah, and do you feel, just based on where trends are heading, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, like, what happens when grow more and more we're growing into a society where men are being more sexually excluded, or even romantically excluded, because of this shift in education enrollments and the use of dating apps, which certainly doesn't favor men. What happens?
Yeah, I mean, there's this, natural, you mentioned the hypergamous strategies of women, where women generally tend to prefer men who are, taller, earn more money, more educated, more successful, or at least as equally successful as themselves, if not more so. And what's interesting is that preference for successful men increases, with socioeconomic status of the woman. In other words, there used to be this belief that as women became more successful, more economically independent, more educated, that they would be willing to kind of date down in terms of the socioeconomic status of their male partner, because they themselves are economically sufficient, so they don't need to look for that partner, that quality in a partner anymore. But if anything, it goes the other way, where the more successful a woman is, the more likely she is to want a man who is at least as successful as herself. And you can see this with, research on women with advanced degrees or with high incomes, women who are millionaires, and women who are billionaires. So a female billionaire is far more likely to be married to a male billionaire than a male billionaire is to be married to a female billionaire. Male billionaires generally tend to be married to successful women, um, but not as successful as themselves, but women who are generally educated and upper middle class and above. But female billionaires overwhelmingly will only marry a male billionaire. So, and you see this in, kind of a lower level with dating apps, where at least, the early studies on Tinder showed that on average, men would like something like 60% of the female profiles they came across. Whereas for women, they liked about 4% of the male profiles they came across. And you can imagine a lot of those 4% of men, like, there was overlap such that many of the women were swiping on the same men, which has given rise to, you've probably, some of your listeners may be familiar with, like, these groups, like on Facebook and other platforms, called "Are We All Dating the Same Guy?" Where women kind of swap notes on who they're dating to see if other women have gone on dates with them. Because, especially in large anonymous cities, if you're a successful and desirable man, you can date lots of women simultaneously, and these women will not know each other because of, the nature of being in a metropolitan area where, social circles don't overlap. And so women have organically found this way around it to try to find out, are they being played or not. But, this is kind of inevitable, I think, where as more men fall behind, the remaining number of men who are successful often aren't eager to settle down, because men have different priorities, especially when they're young and not yet ready to get married. They enjoy sleeping with lots of women. And so I think that this hypergamy and the fact that there have always been, a small number of desirable men who've been able to date lots of women, that's always been around. You go back to like pre-social media, read about, I don't know, Frank Sinatra or something, like, male celebrities and stuff. They've always had more options than the average guy. But with the rise of social media, with dating apps, with Hinge and Instagram and other things, that now if you're a successful guy, you can literally have access to, all of the world's most attractive women. And those women, this may create these perverse incentives where these women are, they're only looking for certain types of guys who are very successful, but those guys don't want to commit to them.
Yeah, I mean that's a prime example of the luxury belief, right? These type A successful men that don't have to necessarily commit because they've got a lot of options. So they're trying to promote polygamy as the righteous thing to do, but it doesn't really favor the vast majority of men. Probably doesn't even support vast majority of what women want either. But obviously they have to kind of go along with it because that's kind of the nature of who they're trying to select in the dating marketplace. Um, and yeah, I had this conversation with, do you know TJ Power? He's a neuroscientist.
The name sounds familiar, but I'm not familiar with his work.
Yeah, he talks a lot. We actually got into a pretty good deep conversation about the rising usage of porn in young men and the psychological effects of that. And because of the fact that men are quite lonely today, because it's hard to date and settle for the partner that they're looking for, there's this thing called the Coolidge effect, and it's something that they observed in mammals and humans, obviously as well, where sexual interest and arousal are renewed by the introduction of a novel sex partner. So porn basically mimics that, and because it offers us endless novelty, but the brain doesn't know the difference. It's kind of tricking the brain to thinking that you're encountering new mates, and essentially it trains the brain to satisfy the needs that you would get with actually having a partner and the motivation that it requires to get a partner uh, with this endless novelty. And it obviously decreases any motivation that they have to actually go out and pursue, to go talk to a stranger, to ask them out. So it's this, the more loneliness that men are getting, the more porn they're watching. And because of the porn they're watching, it's inducing more loneliness because it also affects friends. You don't have the motivation because you're releasing all this oxytocin from watching porn as well. You're not incentivized to go on and hang out with your friends either. So I guess how can young men find purpose in a world that feels like they're kind of running up a hill again? So you found it through military and through the disciplines that it gave you there. What advice would you have for young men today?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point about the Coolidge effect. And yeah, I wonder if we, that's like the dark matter of society. We don't know exactly like what its effects are on behavior of, there's survey data showing that, something like 60% of 18 to 29-year-old men have never approached a woman even once in their lives. And this has increased over time. And yeah, if you are being sort of superficially stimulated and satisfied by porn, then yeah, that's going to sap your motivation to go out and actually talk to real women. Because talking to women, it can be anxiety inducing, especially if you're young and inexperienced. And you want like all the wind at your back. You want all the motivation, all systems in place in your biology and your body and your mind to go talk to women and talk to people in general, just the ability to develop those social skills. But if those are being artificially satisfied through, whatever, like group chats with your friends, and then porn when it comes to romantic relationships, and, video games when it comes to feelings of satisfaction and accomplishment, then, there's no need to go out and actually take risks. And yeah, there's interesting data on declining numbers of young people who are interested in getting a driver's license. And initially this surprised me because, when I was 16, it was like of course, especially if you're a young boy, you want to get a license because you want to impress girls and you want to go drive around with your friends and go on dates and those kinds of things. But now, yeah, like what we if you but driving like objectively without all of those benefits and the idea of having fun with your friends and impressing girls without those rewards, what is driving? It's you're driving a dangerous machine that can be nerve wracking while you're learning the process of doing it. And if you don't have an incentive to do so, then of course young people aren't going to want to do it.
The cost as
Um,
well.
yeah. Oh yeah. There are financial costs and social costs, and if the benefits don't outweigh that, then fewer people are going to be interested. Um, so yeah, how do people find you know, motivation, success? I don't know if you can if there is necessarily like a deliberate way you can do it. Like I want to find my purpose, so I'm going to go do XYZ. I think you just have to put yourself out there and try different things in the real world. One way you could do is just what's worked for other people in the past. It could be the military, it could just be getting a job, it could be working on a project that you feel some excitement and passion for. Um, and on the other side of that, to just shed habits that are bad for you. So even if you don't have a plan of what to do, you can at least create a list of things of what not to do. And then hopefully more productive activities will fill that time instead. So, you know, spend a little less time playing games, cut out porn, cut out, anything, weed, whatever it is that seems to kind of sap and diminish your drive, to just stop doing those things and find other ways to occupy your time. Things that, may be more productive, could go going to the gym, it could be reading, it could be, I don't know, watching motivational YouTube videos, just something that will, point you in the right direction. And then hopefully, along the way, you'll fumble your way through and find something that will give you the motivation and purpose that you want.
Do you think there's an argument to be made that, similar to, I guess, what you did, whether it was something that you wanted to do or not, that men in their late teens to early 20s should just forgo even trying to prioritize relationships, but rather working on themselves to become the type of person, to attract the type of person that they want?
Yeah, yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, especially when you're young. We mentioned those years, late teens to early 20s, of just focus on self improvement, on mindset, and I mean that doesn't mean like go into like monk mode and neglect all of your relationships and stop trying to make friends and stop asking people out. But focus on trying to become the type of person that other people would find desirable and that they would want to have in their lives. Think about, well, what kind of friend would I like to have? Or, if I were a woman, what type of boyfriend would I like to have? And then try to, you know, do everything you can to elevate yourself and to improve yourself to that position. Um, yeah, because when you're 18 or 19, it's, you're just by default going to have very little to offer people. So, do what you can to improve yourself. And a lot of people, they spend a lot of time thinking, who's the right person for me? What kind of person do I like? Do I like this person? Do I like that person? But also take a step out of your own head and think, well, who would like me? Like there are ways to level up in your own life so that the quality of person who you hope to attract will be interested in you as well.
Yeah, I think that's helpful for people. Um, for yourself, just going back to Troubled and kind of the memoir that you wrote, did you struggle with imposter syndrome at all through this history of past and going to these Ivy League schools and becoming an author and speaker? I mean, do you still go through that now? And how did you manage it if it's in the past?
I had a little bit of it when I first arrived at Yale. This was 2015, my first year. I was a very mediocre high school student. I took some night classes at a community college when I was enlisted, and I was took the SAT. Like I knew I was by that point. I knew I was a pretty smart guy, but I was also around people who trained their entire lives to go to a school like that. Went to expensive private boarding schools and test prep and all these sort of academic advantages that led them to a place like Yale. And so, yeah, I was just impressed. Like even things like retention, like their ability to read multiple papers and basically retain everything that they'd read because they were naturally they had the aptitude for it, but then they'd also sort of been trained in all of the sort of study skills that would allow you to do something like that. And I didn't have those skills at first, and it took me a little while to catch on. But then after a while, I noticed I was able to keep up and move along, and then that was probably like the most acute feeling of imposter syndrome was maybe that first semester, that first year on campus. Since then, not really. I've been around a lot of smart people and haven't really had, there have been a few scary smart people that I've met. And I guess in my mind, I thought everyone was going to be like that. And then after a while, you go to a selective university and you realize most of the people there are, just kind of normal smart people. And there are going to be a handful of, sort of scary, smart, intelligent geniuses. But they're generally kind of, in the numerical minority. But it's nice to meet those people and recognize just sort of what real intelligence looks like. Versus just your kind of run-of-the-mill smart person. So yeah, and then when the book came out, public speaking, those kinds of things. I mean, that's like I said, I have to give a lot of credit to my experiences when I was enlisted. It was just learning how public speaking and dealing with people, and taking on tasks that you think maybe you're not equipped for, but you sort of muddle your way through and figure it out, and you can be as nervous and anxious as you are on the inside, but as long as you project an image of confidence and you accomplish your task, that's all that really matters. So I didn't really have it. Actually, when I was writing the book, I felt a little bit of it because I was young. I was 29 when I started writing Troubled, and I wondered at times, am I too young to write a book? Am I too young to write a memoir? But I went ahead with it, and I figured I may not get another chance to write a book in my life. And I figured at some point I would write a memoir of some kind anyway, because when I got to college and then grad school, and I realized just how few people in these elite institutions had heard of stories like mine, I thought it would be important to write this and sort of share this story. And so I figured, okay, maybe middle age, late in life, something like that, I could put something together. But the way things worked out, it ended up happening much earlier, and that turned out to be a benefit in some ways, because a lot of the memories I write about are from my early childhood, which were still relatively fresh in my mind, and a lot of the people I grew up with are still alive and around, and I was able to contact them and sort of piece together the memories of everything that had happened. But yeah, by now I don't really feel too much imposter syndrome. I still get nervous with public speaking. I still feel a little bit of the butterflies if I'm on a panel, and especially if there's a large audience. But I've done it enough times, like with anything, you do it enough, and even if you are nervous, you've done it before, and you have this wealth of experience you can draw on to sort of mitigate those feelings.
Yeah, man, it's such an inspiring story, especially for someone that's quite young, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that probably think that they should be doing something that they've been wanting to do for a while, but do it in 10 years or do it in 15 years. And sometimes you just need someone else to give you that permission. So appreciate that, Rob. And yeah, I want to close it off by obviously appreciating the time that we've spent here. Where can people learn more about you? And where can people find the book? Obviously, we'll have that link down below. But anything else that you want to share?
You can find my Substack, robkhenderson.com. You can find me on Twitter at robkhenderson, or I guess X. Although, it's funny. I've asked, so sometimes I'll teach classes for the summer, college students and sometimes high school students. And I always ask them, do you call it Twitter or X? And Twitter is still kind of the the favored name for the platform. So
This is a generation that
yeah,
grew up with Twitter, though, right? I wonder what
yeah,
the
like Gen
Gen X,
Alpha.
yeah, Gen
Yeah,
Alpha, what they would be
yeah.
saying.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder too because I taught this class for high school students, and I asked them, and most of them said, "Oh, we still call it Twitter," and these were like 16-year-old kids. Um, so yeah, Instagram, same thing at Rob K Henderson, and yeah, you can get the book wherever fine books are sold. So yeah, I appreciate your time, Sean. This has been great.
Awesome. I appreciate you, Robin. Thanks, God, for tuning in. Cheers.
Thanks.